Martin.
Hi. You were in you have exhibited as yourselves as artists, or when you are invited by an institution to show something, does that place you in a fundamentally different position? In the difference between being an artist and being what you are, perhaps, which is enablers. So perhaps you could talk about that. So the desire, for example, or the need to make an artifact.
Hello, testing. Yeah. Actually, yeah, we've not made a lot of artifacts, which also could be quite problematic in our kind of practice. But I was thinking in terms of like, but we do get invited to some institutions, not a lot, right? But what I thought was important in terms of making the region was the precise geopolitics of it. Because I think yesterday Noble was mentioning about these 3 stratas of approach that happened. So one was artist-run spaces, and I can't remember the other 2 now. But what I thought was, I think that what I want to say is that actually we are many things at the same time. It's just which role we're playing. But I think that the thing is that we don't know which works. And the thing about like this haunting thing that sort of came about, right, was that actually we are not really activists, but we get thrown into some situations, and actually what becomes really frightening was that, you know, I get quite frightened when a police asks me for my number, especially if she's very cute, right? But I think, but actually that's what it is. Actually we are not sure, and we are all new in this, and how do we kind of practice that over and over again until you get it right? So I think that's kind of what I want to, I don't know if that answers the question.
So it's an ongoing response to situations. That's the key thing, being a response to a situation rather than a plan.
I think it depends on the context. Usually the curator or the person who invites us will kind of say what they're more interested in, and then we may or may not agree to do something like that. So for example, when we did a show in the Art Museum as part of Unearth, they were specifically saying that they wanted Bukit Brown Index, which was a project that we did that's related to land contestation in reference to a cemetery that was under threat. So we did that.
Sorry, which museum was this?
Singapore Art Museum.
Okay, Art Museum, not National Gallery.
No, it wasn't open yet. Yeah. So because we worked on that project for 3 years, we tried to save it. That was kind of like a more activistic thing, not an art thing. We did tours, which was maybe art, maybe activist thing, and then we also did a real kind of artwork, which was Bukit Brown Index, and so we showed that because they wanted that. And then also, like for example, we are going to Tokyo in July, and they specifically wanted us to do a Tokyo really free market. And the free market is a project that we've been doing since 2010 or 2009. So it's an ongoing thing in Singapore. Every 2 months we do it. It is a market where everything is free. So we basically just set up the space and people come. They could give free things or free services, and it is kind of a community bonding or resource sharing, or recycling event where people just share things for free. And we kind of made this into an artwork, which took place in London, in Fukuoka, in Chiang Mai, in different places, and then Tokyo wanted that, so we are doing that. So it kind of depends on the context.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Sharon, hold on.
I'm actually interested in the difference between Japan, or maybe the similarities. I'm surprised by the apparent similarities between Japan and Singapore with regard to the depth of public engagement with issues like what does it mean to talk about the public. I'm just wondering, with Jen, if you think that if Singapore was much more democratic, okay, to put it bluntly, there was much more of a vibrant and robust debate in, say, media, and other regular democratic spaces that you see in other countries, that in some ways your work would have the carpet kind of pulled from under it, because you seem to be doing something in response to the fact that all this is lacking in some significant way in Singapore. I'm presuming a lot of things, and please push back on what I'm saying, but what's really surprised me about Hiroyuki's this narrative is it seems to suggest, because I always think of Japan as very democratic, and I'm kind of like shocked that people would just simply think, because you have a communist party, for God's sake, you have I know that's true of Vietnam too, but I mean is that you have a full range of political participation in Japan that Singapore just does not have, right? So why is the public, as it were, public culture so, in your narrative, so shallow?
Okay, so let me rephrase this. So Tian and Jennifer, if you could think a little bit and sort of respond to how do you think your practice would change if there were certain kinds of changes? Perhaps, let's say, stronger opposition political parties, for one, or a freer media, maybe along those lines. And then Hiroyuki, how do you explain this problem? So maybe we can start with Hiroyuki and then go to.
Well, I think it's related to my encounter with Southeast Asian artists and collectives. For example, I did a project with Luan Lupa, and I was surprised from their attitude. For example, I think I learned a lot from them, not only from them, but for example, for them, I think the idea of public is creating by themselves. You have right to have some. You have right to access the public. You yourself can produce your necessity public spaces. So I really surprised this idea of public, and then compared to their attitude, I think, I was surprised. For 10 years, I have been working for institution in Japan, and then it's actually running by also local government, and almost all the funding are coming from tax of people paid, and so lots of projects. We of course we can do a project very freely, and even under this organization or public institution, but when I encountered artist collectives in Southeast Asia, I suffered that or in Japan, lots of curators or artists or anybody initiated project more like not passive, but not conscious about what you are doing, or where is your position, or what is your right. So I don't want to say all the Japanese people feeling public is something you are given from somebody, but I was inspired more from people outside of Japan who try to create their own idea of public. So we Japanese have, I felt we Japanese have to learn from them a lot. For example, in Jakarta, they don't have a strong public institution, but because of this situation, I think they can create their own idea of public. So because in Japan, we have a so-called public institutions, then we didn't think seriously about what is public. So that's a problem what I felt through my collaboration or experience with Asian other friends or artists. It makes sense?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, there's been some research to suggest that under British colonialism, Singapore had a very vibrant civil society.
Yeah.
That, the paradox is independence and a national government kills initiatives, that the state comes in and overpowers everything. So you have this really paradoxical situation. Sorry, I didn't speak into the mic.
Yeah. So Jen and Tian, just if there was, let's say, a more free press.
Yeah, I agree, because I think it's precisely because in Japan as well as Singapore, the government is doing so much, people don't, you kind of just go along and you don't think about it anymore. Whereas in Indonesia, I think people really had to, come together and do something to make things happen for themselves. But I don't think it's just about democracy. There is also a lot of social pressure, I think, for people to conform and kind of, behave like one another. That probably is maybe stronger in Japan, I'm not sure. So.
Yeah, I think it's important to think, that you have democracy in terms of like political structure, but you also have democratic cultural practices or traditions or conventions. So, for instance, when I taught at La Salle in Singapore, the art college there, I had a lot of freedom, but I wouldn't always receive responses from the students that were sort of really taking advantage of the kind of freedom that I would try to encourage them. So there was, sometimes you can create these spaces, but the spaces won't really be activated by the students or so forth.
Yeah, I think people are, mostly still afraid of saying the wrong things or offending someone else. So it's not just about the political situation, it's really the kind of the culture, the everyday thing that we go through in Singapore.
But then to point out that what you're doing is you're enabling existing sort of tendencies as well. It's not as if you're inventing conversation and inventing. So you're, as Martin said, this, use the word enabler. So, in the positive sense, rather than enabling your alcoholic friend or whatever. But, there are things out there that by putting them in a particular kind of juxtaposition with each other, there's a sort of extension, further generation, and so forth.
I think we do try to push certain things in general directions, but people have their own agency, which we believe very much in. So we don't want to direct too much as well. So it's just more about creating opportunities for things to happen. I think also for people to think about possibilities. I think that is quite important. As opposed to us telling them what it should be.
I want to get back to Hiroyuki, because one thing that Sharad pointed out was there is a strong narrative in your presentation, sort of a sequence of events. For instance, the turn in 2011 with another earthquake. It's interesting that you have two earthquakes that also frame your story. But the other thing that was happening, a narrative strand, was the rural sort of art development and the urban. And the rural art development seemed to be very conservative in some ways. And there is that sort of very strong conservative aspect of Japan ideologically. And nature is often always associated with the conservative. But then, what happens to change so much of awareness are these, natural events, right? The earthquake causes people to realize that one cannot be conservative. So you have the rise of activism there. So I thought that was a really interesting thread in your narrative as well, the relationship to nature. On the one hand, there's the conservative expectation, and then also the radicalness of nature. And I think Japan has always sort of also recognize this. We didn't end up talking about Godzilla very much, but I had mentioned Godzilla at breakfast. Yeah. So the imagination of the natural sort of great interrupter has been a big part of Japanese sort of culture. Yes, Home, question. Do you have the mic there?
Yeah.
Folks? Great.
Oh,
Thank you.
yeah. Okay. So I'm actually very curious about the ghost hunting project. I remember we were sitting at the dinner table and we were talking about this, about sharing stories about ghost stories in Vietnam and in Singapore. I think there's something very peculiar about ghost stories, not only about the excitement that it generates, but also it kind of continues this oral tradition that we have in many cultures in Southeast Asia have this oral tradition when you will tell one story, another person will pass on that story, and there'll be variation just based on that oral kind of distortion, your personal distortion. And that to me, it's very much related to space making, connected to the oral traditions. And I also, we grow up with Japanese manga a lot, so we can't escape this. Japan is also quite obsessed with spirits. From a lot of, at least from media culture that we've seen, there's ghost apparitions in Japan a lot, and a lot of supernatural sightings. But I also curious about, because in Japan and in Singapore, migration is also an issue. And we also think of migrants as like these ghosts of globalizations. Like these things that we know they're there, but we sometimes force ourselves not to see them. So there's migrant, there's people having to cross boundaries to go to another space. So I guess for Hiroyuki, I want to ask, what do you think about that? Like the link between migrations and these kind of ghostly figures, and how do you think that factors into the art scenes in Japan, or does it? And for Post Museum, I think what is your next step with with space making through the hunting stories? Maybe that's what I'm curious about.
So you said migration and ghost.
Migration. So so let's say Vietnamese people going to Japan, trying to find jobs.
The relation between migration and ghostry, you said?
Like oral, like this ghostly existence. Like migrants as ghosts in urban space.
What I also really like is the image of the migrant as a ghost, because it's so difficult to see. So something that we cannot see, the idea of the ghost is something we cannot see.
We know they're there.
Yeah. or we try to deny that they're there. Yeah.
Okay. Wow. It's
Take your time.
Well, okay. In Japan, I think well, I don't know if I can answer your question, but in Japan, so for example, there are so many Korean Japanese people, and when I was a child, like 30 years ago, it was not so obvious. Like if you are the Korean Japanese people had Japanese name at that time, so it's really hidden. I mean, around in my class, in my school, at least in same class, at least 2-3 students are like Korean Japanese. But now it's more open. But when I was a child, the people tend to hide he or she are Korean Japanese. I think it's and not only Korean Japanese, but especially like Korean Japanese people. The position of Korean Japanese people was very difficult around 70s, 80s, but now it's gradually changing. the situation gradually changing. So, and then now we have more immigrants from different countries. For example, my hometown, Nagoya, Aichi, there were so many Brazilian Japanese people. It's very obvious, you know, because we have a Brazilian town, and but it's still very separated. Like, you know, there is, because of Brazilian Japanese town, the people tend to living this area, like Brazilian people living this area, and they go to school of Brazilian students. Then, like, community was really separated. For example, for during Aichi Triennial, we try to do project with Brazilian community, but it's really not easy because, how can I say, large number of the Brazilian Japanese are very unstable. I mean, if the economic down, most of them move to different places. So making kind of a community development is not easy, and it's really big problem. Well, and I don't know still how, like, how art or idea of democracy can work with this kind of community or difficulty, or it's like not hidden, but the problem is people, very few people feeling that this kind of situation as problem, and lots of people don't know so much about this situation. I think if you are living in Tokyo, maybe people don't know. In my place, Aichi, there was a town of Brazilian people. So I think huge majority still didn't feel Japan is country of migrants of many different nations, ethnicities. Still people, not a small number of people believe like only Japanese, or, well, I don't, it's, sorry, but it's very big problem now still under unconsciousness is very most difficult.
Hiroyuki, do you think maybe, let's say in film, in Japanese film, that more recently the theme of the migrant might be emerging in film? Because I think, you know, like what you say, when you have the problem of an art institution trying to reach out to a transient community that doesn't have that stability, it's harder. But then to see, let's say, in themes like film or literature, that I mean, themes in film and literature, it might become a little bit more common. I wouldn't know, but perhaps.
No.
Is there a film that you can think of?
I think indirect way there are so many things, but I think maybe those community didn't require any kind approach from a direct way, from like art or social something.
Yeah. Okay, shall we move on to Jen and Tian with the Holmes version of the question? What's next for you in terms of haunting, and you know, if you've got a project in the works?
Okay. It started with Bukit Brown, actually, the haunting projects, because we started mapping where the hauntings, because Bukit Brown was actually an interesting project because it really deals with a very fixed boundary where the contestation was happening. But what we were interested in were all the supernatural that were occurring in that boundary, and how do we understand it in terms of land contestation issues there. So, but what we're actually still just doing is sort of researching. I mean, I think we're just very fixated with it. I don't think there's a lot of concrete projects that's coming out of haunting itself. But I wanted to sort of think about that, because I think that what we're interested in are really a lot of fragments of little things that sort of goes on in our meetings with people. But I wanted to draw back to that first night where Zhang was talking, right? I hope I got her name right. But she was really talking. She had this reading of 3 genres of TV programs, and actually, what I thought was really interesting about it was, for me, was a way of reading resistance. And I think that's also one of the very interesting tradition of cultural studies, was where do you find resistance? Not in the obvious. Not in the obvious. I mean, like, resistance could be you standing against a bulldozer and stopping a bulldozer from, or standing in front of a machine gun, burning yourself. You know, those are very obvious resistance. But how do you find resistance of the everyday? What happens? And I thought that, I think what I wanted to say, pick from that was, I was interested in what she was saying, but I was also interested in how she was reading those resistances in Vietnam. And I think that that's one of the problem. I think Sherrod was mentioning about this book. I love that book about pre-colonial or civil society movements. And the story ends with the PAP. And I think I have the same complaint as Giao, actually. Maybe maybe our fixation with the immediate politics, with the immediate, is so, that apparition, that ghost is haunting us so badly that we have blind spots, that we're not able to understand where we truly are and what we can truly do. And I think that's one of the problem, I think, with a lot of the Singapore studies stuff. We are quite fixated with the PAP, that we almost forgot that the Cold War happened. We almost forgot a lot of things happened. And I thought one of the interesting way of rereading and looking at different people's practices, from designers and people who sort of inhabit the city, and look through from activists who work with migrant workers, it's quite fascinating to sort of want to rethink that, but to rethink that collectively, not because we just want to hold hands and think collectively, but also that then what kind of sense can we make of it, and what can they do, and what can both this, when there's an intersection of knowledges, what actually becomes interesting. I think that's one of the key things. And I think that this is also apparently a problem, right? I mean, like, I don't know why Zero Station only invite us for 3 days. We should be here for 1 year, you know? I think. No.
You should take the role of the director of Zero Station.
Okay, oh really? Oh, thank you. We should all take turns to be the director. Yeah, but I think precisely this, that, you know, this migrant issues is really complicated. The reason why, I mean, Singapore is great, is the hub. We are the center of human trafficking, no doubt about it. Yeah, and one of the interesting about criminology studies, people who study criminology, is really how, that is the back, the dirty side of the city really allows us to understand how we plug into global capital. That's really fascinating. But I mean, as artists, we can only sort of grasp, because I read terribly. But one thing we encourage everyone to do in our reading groups is just read it, tell me what it means, and then we work out the problems. And actually, I found that process really rewarding, because it was interesting to see different people actually take a certain text a certain way, a certain body of knowledge a certain way, and actually find interesting readings. Because we only know that the world's problem is getting complicated, right? This immigration issue, we talk about neoliberalism, but actually, you know, it really just kind of happened, but it keeps changing. You know, our lives are full of precarity. We have no full-time jobs. Everyone's a part-timer. Suddenly, we have so much freedom to work when we want and what we want, but we are really afraid because tomorrow we can't pay the rent. Yeah. So there's so much issues that's embroiled in where we are, but actually where we are is actually really linked to a network of things, which I can't make sense of. And I think to also return to this, one of the interesting thing about Marx is that, you know, well, this is the other Marx, the older Marx, right? That, and it's a popular thought, right? That the proletariat doesn't exist today. Where do you find the proletariat? He's the Uber driver, he is everything. But the interesting thing is that we have no connection with the Uber driver other than the fact that I have to go to place A to place B. And that's the interesting thing I find about art is that maybe it holds a little bit of potential to what Zoe was saying on that first day where she talked about how academics actually don't, is always dissing the art, like, you know, oh, you guys have no factual, you know, real body of knowledge to substantiate what you're arguing. But I think then that's, if we think of knowledge in that way, then, you know, that doesn't make sense. But what we want to do is really take knowledge in the way that maybe that should allow us to see the world of possibilities rather than to be skeptical about what's happening now. Because what's happening now is pretty shit. But maybe, yeah, if we spend like the whole night talking, I tried this before. Yeah, I mean, I talked with Gong, right? Actually, if we start talking for 12 hours, actually something will happen. I don't know what. Yeah, so maybe that's what the ghost is, right? This is what the haunting is. You're exercising your spirits. And
Jen, do you have anything to add? So Lynn, we'll take the last question from you. Thank you.
Over the last few days, we heard a lot of projects and collectives about community-based and public-based projects. And just what you mentioned about Singapore as a hub of multicultural with many different nations and language all over Southeast Asia. So when you're working in this project, engaging with the public and community, like how do you deal or how do you engage different community together, since maybe they have different kind of culture and languages, and also even different class, like working class and maybe so. I'm just curious, how can you engage them and even dealing with this kind of misunderstanding? Because I'm sure with this, it's not easy to living with different people together. And
you know, this is another joke, right? You know, like Biennales and, you know, big art festival, we commission artworks for communities. I have never seen anyone commission, you always commission the underprivileged. Yeah, the people that cannot have access to art. And what's really interesting is that I have never seen a commission that, you know, like Singapore Biennale commissions a special artwork for the 1% of the 1%. This artwork is for the ultra rich. But, I mean, I think it's funny as a proposition, but actually if you really think about it, what this 1% of the 1% do in the world that we're in has a lot of power. It really determines the prices of places. When the 1% of the 1% arrives in a neighborhood, it's cool, but you know, that means that things are getting expensive and then things start changing around you, and that's really interesting. I think that what becomes a problem, but which becomes actually a really good problem, because actually I think that America was actually this thing, I forgot, new public art. They used to commission a lot of public art and community art projects. And actually a lot of good historians have done work on critiquing that kind of approach of art. And I think that there's two things that we approach. And actually for us, we learn a lot of the things from different community or people. So we actually learn a lot from walking about, which we do with social work and people doing campaigning. So actually, I realized that over the years I've become better at talking to different people. Sometimes I stand there and people want to talk to me for some reason, even if I don't want to talk to them. But I feel that because in social work, you learn how to, like if you go block from block and talk to people and how to interview people, they're actually quite fixed methodologies. And similarly, when we think of new public art, there were a set of methodologies of interacting with people. And we think about like how Borean use things of relational aesthetics, or Grant Custer thinks of dialogical art. Yeah, he seems to have some sort of framework, but because that returns to this thing that, of course, I mean, this framework comes from a body of work that happens in America and happens in Europe, and this was one of the problems we were discussing with Kunji from Antarixa was, he was talking, and Tang also last night, we're talking about the lack of vocabulary to describe sense of community that happens not in the same way. So how do you, if we're saying that if we describe the way that the Cold War in America looks at the Soviet bloc was individualism versus collectivism, and then this doesn't really happen here. You hate individualism, you hate collectivism, but you know, there's a deeper sense. There's probably a better vocabulary to describe it, but we need to spend time as researchers and cultural workers to sort of figure that out. And what is that, and how do you kind of relate it with each other? Do we actually have a common framework, or actually an uncommon framework to work with, actually?
Thank you, Tian, Jennifer, Hiroyuki. Thank you, Zero Station, and thank you, all of you tonight.